Hey guys, and welcome back to a brand new video. Today we're going to be diving into Premiere Pro and I'm going to walk you through my entire color grading workflow. We're going to be taking this clip from this to this in just a matter of minutes, and I'm going to show you every single step of the way. So without further ado, let's dive into Premiere Pro and let's get this video started. All right, so here we are inside of Premiere Pro, and this is the clip we are going to be color grading. This is what it looked like when it was shot over in log. So this is straight out of the camera. Now I do want to run you through something very quickly. A lot of the times when people are color grading log footage, especially, they're going to be using something called a conversion LUT. And by all means, you can go ahead and use one of those, but for this video, I'm going to be color grading everything from scratch. This isn't my usual workflow that I use all of the time when I am color grading, because personally, I do use LUTs. I actually use my cinematic LUTs, and if you haven't heard of my cinematic LUTs before, I would strongly recommend to go and check them out, as it can speed up your workflow like crazy. And if you like the look of my clips, my color grading, my colors in my videos, then I would strongly recommend to go and check them out once again, because I use my LUTs on every single one of my creative projects to get the looks that I do. But like I mentioned, today we're not going to be using any LUTs because that would be teaching you absolutely nothing. So we're going to be doing everything from scratch. Cool. Got it? Let's get into it. So here we are inside of Premiere Pro, and the first thing I want to let you know is that I'm in the color tab right here. Things might be looking a little bit different for you, especially if you've just opened up Premiere Pro. Chances are you're in the assembly tab or the learning tab, but if you want to be color grading, make sure you're over in the color tab, and that should open up Lumetri Color. Now I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so you can see the changes that I'm making on screen, and I'm also going to make this a little bit smaller to make sure our preview is as big as possible. Now, aside from the Lumetri Color panel over here on our right, I also want to make sure you've got the Lumetri Scopes panel open. For me, that's just over here, and yours might be looking a little bit different. And if you can't see this, what you want to do is come into Window and then make sure you have Lumetri Scopes enabled. And by the way, if you can't see your Lumetri Color panel, make sure you have Lumetri Color enabled, and then you should be able to see both of these panels. Cool, so once we've got these two things open, it's time to set up our Lumetri Scopes, and then we can get into color grading. So make sure you've got your Lumetri Scopes panel open over here, and you want to have two scopes enabled. You want to have the vector scope and the waveform enabled. All I've done there is right clicked. Then you want to make sure vector scope and waveform are enabled. If you've got histogram or the parade on, you can just turn those off. For now, we're only going to be using these two scopes. Now these two scopes are super interesting, and they are very different from each other. On the left-hand side, we've got the waveform. Now personally, I use this just to monitor my exposure. Anything that is above 60, 50, and 40 is going to be bright. Anything below 60, 50, and 40 is going to be dark, and anything in the midtones is going to be the kind of mid-tone area of our shot. So you can see here we've got a load of detail in between, I would say 80 and 20, which is great, which means my image was exposed correctly, but it's also quite kind of crammed in. It's quite compressed. And if we have a look at our shot, you can see that we've hardly got any contrast in our image. So the more compressed your waveform is, the flatter and less contrasty your shot is. And you'll see as we're moving through and progressing with our color grade, and while we're adding a load of contrast back into our shot, you'll actually see the waveform move in all kinds of weird and wonderful ways. So that's the waveform out of the way. And then we have this little circle here. This is our vector scope. Now I use the vector scope for one thing only, and that is checking my skin tones. If we have a look closely, there's actually this very faint line in between yellow and red. And I'll show you in just a moment how we can absolutely nail our skin tones. But this line right here is our skin tone line, and this is where we want our skin tones to be sitting. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, and hopefully you've now got a little bit of a rough guide of how Lumetri Scopes work, let's dive into the color grade. Okay, so first up on the list, we are going to open up our basic correction tab. And like I said before, we've hardly got any contrast in this shot, so it's time to add it all back in. But we don't want to just kind of crank our contrast slider and be done with it. We want to make sure we're adding it a little bit more intently and exactly how we want things to look. So the first thing I'm going to do, and the first thing I always do, is come over to the shadows slider here and just start to reduce the shadows. And as you can see, if we have a look over at our waveform here, you can actually see we've now got a lot more information in the bottom end of our waveform, and that's indicating that we now have darker parts in our image, which is great. It means we're moving in the right direction. But we can't just reduce the shadows and not do anything else, as it still leaves us with somewhat of a flat image. Also, just a quick side note, I very rarely find myself just maxing out a slider when I'm either increasing it or decreasing it. So leaving the shadows at -100 here, I'm probably not going to do. We'll just back these up to about -85, give or take. So now that we've got our shadows out of the way and things, the darker parts of the image are starting to look a little bit nicer, it's now time to do the opposite with the highlights to make sure we're bringing all those bright parts of our image back in. So we're just going to grab our highlight slider and we're going to start to drag our highlights slider up. Now, as you can see, they're sitting at roughly the same sort of values. That's not a bit of a rule or anything like that. It just happens to be how things look in this shot, and you just want to adjust it until your shot is looking somewhat natural and back to life. Now, if we turn our attention back over to our waveform here, you can see that we've now got values up to 90 and we've now got values down to 10, giving us a very nice even spread of contrast. And if we simply turn our lumetri color off and back on, and you can do this by coming up to this little FX icon, you can see we've got a really nice squished waveform over here, and when I turn this back on, things are much more wide, indicating we've got a whole load of contrast back into our shot. So once we've got a handful of contrast added back into our shot, the next thing I want to do here is correct our white balance. I find it very difficult to correct our white balance when our shot is nearly looking black and white. So once we've added our contrast back in, which brings a little bit of color back into our shot as well, it's now time to correct the white balance. I'm having a look at this shot here, and the skin tones look very accurate, which is usually the first telltale sign if your white balance is a little bit off, but I'm also noticing a lot of green in this image as well. So what we might do here is come over to our tint and add just a slight amount of purple to take off that green tinge a little bit, and then we're going to come to our temperature slider, slide this a little bit blue, slide this a little bit warm, and I would say we might want to lean on the warm side ever so slightly as well. These tiny little changes really don't look like they're adding up to much, but I can assure you that they will over time. Things kind of compound as you're color grading, so just keep that in mind. So with all of that out of the way, let's just have a look at a before and an after. I would say for the basic correction tab, we are looking good. So I'm going to close out the basic correction. We can also skip over creative. This is where you would start to add in your creative LUTs. By the way, if you've already picked up my cinematic LUTs, don't worry, I'll also include a complete LUT walkthrough breakdown of exactly how I use my cinematic LUTs included in your purchase. So for now, we're going to skip over our creative tab and move straight into curves. Now, curves is where we can add a whole lot more of our contrast back into our shot, which is great, but it's also where we start to get to play around with the colors a little bit more, which means we're getting into the fun stuff. So we're first going to make sure we are on our RGB curve. I personally don't use the red, green, or blue curves. I just like to stick with the RGB curve and then make all my color changes in the grading and in the curves below the tone curve. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add 3 dots. This one here for the shadows, this one here for the midtones, and this one here for the highlights. Now, looking at our waveform over here, I think we've got a little bit more room to play with dropping our shadows. So what I'm going to do is grab our shadows dot here and start to bring that down a little bit. You can see some movement over there. I don't want to go too far. Coming over to the midtones now, we're going to increase these just a touch. And then we also might look at increasing the highlights a bit as well. Now, in my opinion, that's sort of washed things out just a little bit. So we might just have to drop our shadow point just a little bit more, but we don't want to go too crazy there. So having a look at a before and after, things are progressing and things are starting to look very nice. Now, moving into our color curves, you can go as crazy as you need here, but just keep in mind that the crazier you go, the more likely your image is to start to fall apart, and just the quality is going to start to degrade as you push and pull things way too far, unless you're shooting in RAW. But as I film this video, about 90% of cameras aren't shooting in RAW. So I'm going to assume you're not shooting in RAW and you're going to be shooting in a profile, just like me, shooting in log. So I'm going to have a look at this image here, and I'm going to start to pick apart and understand what colors I do and don't want in my shot. First things first, I really do not like this green behind our subject. So what I'm gonna do is come over to the hue versus saturation, and we're just gonna mask out or put little dots, setting an in and an out point over the green color. So starting in the yellow spot there, and then putting another dot here where the green sort of wraps up. I'm just clicking there to add those dots. Oh, we've added another dot over there. There we go, looking good. And then I'm just gonna add a dot in the middle and start to drag things down. And as you can see, if I drag that all the way, pretty much the trees now look dead in the background, which is an interesting look, but I don't want them to completely look dead. So we're just gonna desaturate things about halfway-ish. We're gonna move it over to the yellow side a little bit because I can see, especially in this area right here, things are a little bit too saturated for my liking. So I'm just gonna move them over to the yellow side just a little bit, and I would say things are now starting to look pretty good. Now, when it comes to the other colors in this image, there isn't too much going on. There's a lot of orange in this shot. However, I find when you play around with the oranges, the skin tones get added into the mix and it's very hard to separate, for example, this orange tone here just below this lady's neck and then her actual skin tone itself. If we tried to do that, let's say we masked out, maybe make this a little bit more specific, we masked out this tiny little area here and decided to drop it, you can see, yes, we are hitting some of those orange points, but you can also see that we've shredded her skin tone. So that's far from ideal. I like to always try and get my subjects to be wearing something that is contrasty to their skin tone. So wearing oranges, yellows, reds, and pinks is usually a little bit of a no-go when I'm shooting. But as you can see, this is not something that I planned. I had absolutely no control over what these people were wearing, and I just shot some really cool ceremony stuff. So unfortunately, her skin tone is orange and her outfit is completely orange as well, but that is fine. It's definitely not the end of the world. So for now, I would say the hue versus saturation, all the places we can change our saturation levels will be done for now, and let's move into hue versus hue. Now this is where we can change the value of our color. So if we wanted our oranges to be a little bit more red, we could do so. If we wanted this pink fan to be a little bit more red or orange or whatever the case, we could do so as well. And I think for that shot, that is exactly what we're gonna do. If I have a look at our color line here, to be honest with you, no color really stands out, apart from if I maybe set an in and an out point there to kind of match this almost burgundy color, but that's not what we're gonna do. Instead, what we're gonna do is we are gonna open up this little dropper tool right here, and then we're gonna click on our fan. And now Premiere Pro has been able to sample that color and give us an accurate little spot that we can adjust that color on our curve line right here. So now I can click that middle point and I can drag it up and I can drag it down. And as you can see, we're just affecting that one color because there's not many other colors that were already this pink burgundy color. You do want to keep in mind, however, that this is a global change. For example, if I put another dot here and then wanted to change all the oranges, you can see everything is getting changed because there is so much orange in this shot. So back to our little fan here, let's have a look. Moving the point down sort of blends things in a little bit too much. Moving it up, however, starts to make things look pretty nice. It's a very, very subtle change. And what we might do is add the same points above, which is about there, I would say. We can remove that one by holding Command on Mac, Control on Windows and clicking. And we might also just desaturate it a little bit as well. Now, the one last thing I want to do with hue versus hue is to just adjust the yellow hue a little bit. I want to make it a little bit more orange. So as you can see here, we're not really affecting all that much when it comes to yellow. So instead, I'm going to come back to this dropper and we're going to click on the yellow tone right here. Now, I'm really hoping that this isn't going to affect our subject's skin tone all that much, which it's not, thankfully. We've kind of nailed that there. Well, Lightroom sort of nailed that there. So I want to make the yellows a little bit more orange, and now I would say things are looking pretty good. A quick before and after, our shot is definitely progressing and moving in a good way, so we're going to keep going. Now, we're probably going to skip over hue versus luma here, as there's not too much I want to change. This is where you can change the brightness value of a certain color, but for now, I'm looking at this shot and I'm thinking things are looking pretty good. Luma versus saturation and saturation versus saturation just gives you the option to play around with your colors a little bit more. Luma versus saturation means you can select a luminance value, gives you the ability to choose a luminance level, a bright or a darkness level, and then decide how saturated you want that level to be. And then saturation versus saturation allows you to choose a saturation level and then choose how saturated or desaturated you want it to be. But for now, like I said, we're gonna be moving on straight into our color wheels and match. Now, this is where we can push and pull different colors into different parts of our image. So as you can see here, we've got a shadows wheel, we've got a midtones wheel, and a highlights wheel. The shadows wheel is gonna allow us to push a certain color into the shadows, so on and so forth. So looking at this shot here, I'm going to try my absolute best to push a little bit of blue into the shadows to cool off those really warm tones that our subject is wearing. So if we come to our shadows wheel here, we can just click and start to drag blue into the shadows a little bit. Now, you don't want to go overboard here. As you can see, things get out of hand pretty quickly. So you still want to keep things looking somewhat natural. I would say that's looking pretty good. And now that we're going to do the same with the midtones, we might looking at adding just a little bit of a warmer tone here. Let's see how this looks. Kind of making our subject pop from the background a little bit more. And then when it comes to the highlights, it might be wise to push a little bit of blue into the highlights. This is always just a little bit of back and forth. Maybe pushing a little bit of warmth into the highlights actually looks quite nice there. We can turn each individual tool off just by clicking this little toggle, this little slider here. So that's before, that's after. Just by pushing a few little colors into the shadows, midtones, and highlights, it's added a lot of life into our shot, which I absolutely love the look of. Now moving into HSL secondary, this is where we can pick one color and really change it, if you will. We can really adjust a lot of things when it comes to this. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Zach, this is probably the best time where we could really isolate this orange tone right here. However, I don't think we're gonna be able to get that specific, but we should definitely try it out, right? So we come over to this dropper here. Let's zoom in on our shot just a little bit. Of course, it's gonna think that I've clicked right here for the color. We're gonna set our color just by clicking here. Awesome. And then I'm gonna come down to this little checkbox here and we can see exactly where we have selected. So everything in gray is not selected at the moment and everything that is orange is currently selected. Now we can use these sliders down here to sort of expand or decrease our selection. If I grab this slider here, you can see that we can start to add quite a lot of selection back into our shot. And just like that, if we sort of leave it like this for right now, we don't push it too far, you can see that we're actually not selecting our subject's skin tone. So right now, I'm quite happy with the selection. If we turn off the overlay, we can come down to here and then just look at desaturating it just a little bit more. It's sort of reduces the distraction in the image before. So if we just turn this off and on, you can see before her orange shirt was extremely saturated. And now that we've been able to come in here and really fine tune that color, off and on, things are looking super nice. Now I'm gonna move on to the last tool in our Lumetri color toolbox of tools, if you will, which is our vignette tool. Now this is where you can either darken or brighten the corners of your image. Personally, I don't do a lot of my vignette workflow right here, and I'm actually gonna show you my masking workflow after we wrap up this tool, but I'll give you a quick breakdown. We can just darken the corners of our image a little bit, which helps our subject stand out and it sort of reduces a handful of distractions around the corners of our shot. When I use this tool though, I don't feel like I have the absolute most control over where I'm brightening or darkening. So right now, I'm actually gonna double click that. I'm gonna reset that to 0, and now we can get into our masking and Lumetri color effect stacking workflow. But before we do, I almost forgot about our subject skin tones. Like I mentioned before, over with our vector scope right here, we have this little line here that indicates if our subject skin tones are accurate or not. So let me show you exactly how we can use that. So what you want to do is come over to effect controls, and then you want to hit opacity. And now we're looking to just draw a little tiny box around our subject skin tone. So we're just going to come in here. And what this is gonna do is mask out our subject skin tone, and then we can come over to Lumetri scopes, and if we have a look, we can turn off our waveform so we can make this a lot bigger. We want the little faint poof of a line, if you will, to be on that harsh line in between yellow and red. And having a look at this, we've pretty much nailed it. If your skin tones aren't sitting on this line, what you can do is adjust your temperature and tint. You can also come in here to the curves and adjust your hue versus hue. So I could come in here, I could pick the little dropper up, I could click on the skin tone, it'll add some dots in there. I know we've already got a few dots, so it makes things look crazy. I'm gonna Command Z that and undo it. But then you could adjust your skin tone to make sure you can get it sitting on that harsh white line in between yellow and red. I just wanted to make sure you had that in your color grading arsenal. So now what we can do is we can come back over to effect controls, delete this mask, we can zoom back out and now we can move on. So the first thing I want to do is actually decrease the shadows on this shot just a little bit more. I'm looking at this image and still seeing it as a little bit washed out. So let me show you how we're going to do that. Instead of just going into basic correction, maxing this to 100, but still not getting the result that I'm after. I'm going to open up this drop-down menu here, Lumetri Color, add Lumetri Color Effect, come over here, make sure this one is closed, and then I also want to make sure we are on our second one. Now you can right-click here, rename, and I could rename this to Shadow Extra to kind of indicate that this is the Lumetri Color effect that is reducing the shadows a little bit more. And now I can come over here and I can just decrease our shadows a little bit more. Making sure I'm looking at our Lumetri scopes, our waveform specifically. We can turn our vector scope off now. I'm really looking to make sure we have a few more darker tones in our image than we do brighter tones. That's just the look and feel that I like. That's the vibe that I'm after. And I would say now, even just by turning this off and on, just this small change gives us a little bit more room to play with our shadows. And I think things are looking very good now, a little bit more true to life and a little bit more moody. Now, into our masking workflow. What I'm gonna do is add another Lumetri Color Effect, close this one. I'm gonna right click here, rename, and I'm gonna add this as Vignette. Now what we're gonna do here is we are going to add a mask to this Lumetri Color Effect. So we're gonna click on the ellipse tool here, and now I can come here and I can draw this exactly where I want our vignette to be. So I'm gonna leave a little bit more room on the bottom, and I actually want to not include as much of this tree because it's already quite dark. So this is something that you just cannot do with the normal vignette tool, and that's fine. So now that we've got our selection out of the way, actually we might just want to include a little bit more of this lady here. Now we're going to come into mask feather. We're going to increase the feather, which will give us a little bit less of a harsh line if we were to just change any settings. We're also going to come to mask expansion, push this out just a little bit, and then I'm going to click invert, because when you invert it, it now selects the exterior of the mask we just added. And now I can come over here. We can start dropping the shadows. We can start dropping the exposure just a little bit. And this is going to really start to help our subject stand out. Now it is just a little bit annoying that you can't get rid of this mask overlay while you're working on this Lumetri Color Effect. However, if we just hit play on our shot, we can kind of see what things are looking like now. And if we turn this off and back on, our subject is definitely standing out a lot more from the shot, purely because the background and the sort of the corners behind her are a lot darker. Now, something else that I like to add to my vignettes that once again, you definitely can't do in the vignette tool is decrease the saturation. We've got quite a lot of saturated areas here, 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 a little bit up here, not too much up here. But what I might do is just take this down to 90, and it just sort of cools those areas off and once again helps our subject stand out from the shot. Now, with all of that out of the way, I would say our image is done. Let's have a quick before and after look. If we select this Lumetri Color Effect here and we want to turn this off, we also want to turn these off here. So this is where we started. This is our base grade. This was adding a little bit more contrast by lowering those shadows a little bit more. And then this is adding our vignette. Let's play this back. And my goodness, does this shot look so much better. Anyway, guys, that is gonna wrap up today's video. If you enjoyed it, let me know in the comments below. If you wanna speed up your color grading workflow like crazy, go ahead and check out my cinematic LUTs below this video. It'll be the first link in the description, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.